Thank you for coming today, and I'll turn things over to Amy Smith, who is the founding director of MIT's D-Lab and senior lecturer in mechanical engineering at MIT, and she'll be chairing our first panel. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to wish you all a good morning and also welcome you to this session. Yesterday was a great day. It was really insightful to listen to the various sessions on the different intersections of human rights and engineering, and I think participation and inclusion is a really important intersection of those two things. I'd like to thank the academies for I feel like this is an Oscar. I'd like to thank the Academy, but I would like to thank the Academies for putting together this session and the entire symposium. It's been just really great to hear the insights that come from the intersections of disciplines, and these two in particular are really important. I'd like to thank the organizers for everything they've done to help us together, and all the speakers who shared their insights yesterday and will do so today. I'd also like to thank Slido, who is, we're going to do a short Slido question a little bit later in the introduction. So if you guys don't mind taking out your phones and putting up joining this Slido deck, that would be lovely. As mentioned, my name is Amy Smith, and I'm the founding director of MIT D-Lab. D-Lab is a place where we look at collaborative approaches and practical solutions to global poverty challenges. And I teach a course on humanitarian innovation there, and that's been the focus of my work over the last 10 years, is looking at how innovation is practiced in the context of displacement and in particular in refugee camps. So I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues. So I will pass it over to them just to briefly introduce themselves before we continue with the panel. So, Michael?
Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be with you and a delight to interact with you. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Harvard Law School Project on Disability. That's 20 years coming up. I teach at Harvard Law School, Harvard Kennedy School, and sometimes at Harvard Medical School.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm John Kleba. I work at the Aeronautics Technological Institute in Brazil. I'm a social science, working now almost 20 years with engineering students and faculty and extension, engaged extension. And I am the founder and the head of the Laboratory of Citizenship and Social Technologies.
Great. And we may or may not have a fourth member of our panel. John Jaldak is the executive director of the Youth Social Advocacy Team in both Uganda and South Sudan. He's a friend and colleague of mine, and he lives in a land of very limited connectivity. So he's not currently online. His face might appear before us. It won't appear before me, so if you see him, maybe give a little wave so I know he's there. But in any case, I hope he'll be able to share some of his work and his insights into this subject. But if not, I will actually be mentioning a project that we do together. So hopefully you'll get to hear from John Jal, but if not, maybe some other time you'll get to hear from him. Great. So I wanted to sort of start this introduction with a sort of a brief example of why I believe that participation and inclusion is so important in the context of both engineering and human rights. So I'm going to start by asking you a simple question. Well, first of all, how many people in the room are engineers or related to engineering? Okay, great. And so this answer is, I'm expecting 100% response, but even for those of you who are not engineers. So the question is, how many people have made something? And even non-engineers, I believe you must have made something, even if it's just like a bookshelf from IKEA. We've all made something, right? Okay, so here is my Slido question for you. So when you finished it, how did you feel? And if you can just put your response into the Slido. And you can say many things about how you felt about your making accomplishment. And those of you online, I hope that you will also participate, because we're hoping to get a lot of things here. Okay, let's go ahead and click it so we can see the word cloud appearing. Okay, accomplished, satisfied. Exhausted, yes. Okay. I have a friend from Sierra Leone who is, I think he's even now the Minister of Science and Technology and Innovation there. But when he and I did a panel together, he talked about the joy he felt in creating something. So this idea of pride I see being there, accomplished, satisfied. These are all incredibly important things, right? We have an increased sense of agency. You know, once you put that IKEA bookshelf together, don't you feel like you were ready to conquer the world after that, right? So these are all intangible benefits that come from the idea of the process of problem solving as opposed to the products of problem solving. And I think that these benefits are incredibly important when we think about human rights. Right? And when we think about rights, we can also think about needs. So I'd like to see whether this will work. There we go. Okay. Right. And I'm sure most of you have seen this hierarchy of needs, which talk about the things that we need in order to live fulfilled lives as human beings. I think many of these are codified as rights as well, and I thought it was interesting yesterday how some of the speakers talked about the intersections between needs and rights. But, you know, we have the basic needs of shelter, food, security, etc., in order to live. But then we also have these psychological needs and these self-fulfillment needs, achieving our potential, building relationship, etc. And so if you look at this through a technology lens, I believe that using technology satisfies a lot of our basic needs, but creating technology, designing technology, leads to a satisfaction of these higher level needs, right? We usually design things in teams, so we build relationship with our colleagues as we create something, but we also build relationship with the users of the technology that we're creating. Right? We just saw on the Slido that it builds our self-esteem, it builds our belief in our ability to affect our future, etc. So when we talk about inclusion and participation in engineering decision-making, I think that it is incredibly important for us to think about the process of design and engineering, as well as the products of design and engineering, because I think that is fundamentally where a lot of the transformation happens. And I was talking to someone yesterday about sort of the right to be creative, and I think that's something that you don't want to take away from people, because embedded in that right to be creative is this right to feel accomplished, proud, joy, agency, etc. So I wanted to just put that framework around this panel, because all of us on the panel believe that participation and inclusion is important for a variety of reasons. And in the context of engineering decision-making, which is the title of our panel, it's important to think about who's making the decisions and who benefits from making those decisions. Right? So if we look at some of the benefits that come from participation and inclusion in the problem-solving process, you see they are many and varied, right? In some cases, they're tangible in terms of like you build problem-solving skills. You can maybe use tools if you're creating a solution. You learn the process of giving and receiving feedback, but you also gain confidence in your sense of creativity. There's a transformation that happens to you personally, and it helps to, in many ways, combat the sense of dependence that many people, especially refugees and those people affected by conflict and crisis, feel as a result of the aid that they're receiving. So I feel that this is a really important framework to think about. And one of the things that I find, oh, by the way, I'm shifting now from introduction to panelist. So now looking at our work, I feel like it's really important to think about what participation can be. Too often in the field of engineering, we think that if we talk to people to understand their problems and then get their feedback on the solution we've created, that we've done a good job with participation. And that happens a lot, particularly in the field of humanitarian innovation, where I'm doing a lot of work these days. So I wanted to share with you briefly just a framework for understanding and hopefully therefore increasing participation. And the framework sort of characterizes the different roles of stakeholders and the types of participation and defines them to some degree, where we have three main categories, where the first is consultation, where there's an opportunity for the end users to provide information, share opinions, and give feedback. Also, there's an increased level of participation is when the stakeholders actually have decision-making authority. And then finally, the third category is leadership, in which they actually can direct the process and the direction of the project. So within consultation, we have three ways that we think about it. One is a very simple one-way communication, perhaps the way we did the Slido question earlier, right, where people give their input in a single event, but there's really no mechanism for feedback or decision-making. In interaction, it's where we have a bit more of a conversation, right? And there's a two-way flow of information there. It could be through a focus group or something like that, but still the participants don't have much opportunity for feedback or decision-making. And then there's an idea of iterative consultation, where feedback is gathered, an action takes place, and then the participants are able to report on that and give their opinions on what was done in the interim. Wow. Okay, so I guess that's my getting some feedback on the session. Okay, so this is an example of what consultation might look like. This is one of our D-Lab students doing a focus group in India. The next category is partnership, and I view partnership as having two specific ways that it can happen. One is through collaboration, where stakeholders are brought in based on their specific areas of expertise, and they're expected that that's what their input would be, but they also are involved in the decision-making process, but they don't have the ultimate authority. As opposed to co-creation, where the stakeholders who are brought in all participate in an unrestricted way with their entire lived experience, and all stakeholders have equal decision-making authority, right? And so that, to me, is the difference between collaboration and co-creation. And this is what partnership might look like. It's an example from one of our international development design summits, where we bring together community members and people from diverse backgrounds from around the world. And then finally, leadership. I feel that this also has two ways that it can be implemented. The first is empowerment, where the implementer or designer provides input, but with the goal of empowering the stakeholders to make decisions, and where they do have the ultimate authority. And then ownership, when the designer and implementer is literally out of the picture and the process continues. Right. And this is an example of what leadership might look like, where people are designing solutions to the problems that they face themselves. And I'd like to share just a little bit of an example of a project that we've done in this leadership phase. But I did also, before going into that, wanted to just mention that these levels of participation can take place in many different stages in the problem-solving process. This is the design process that we use at D-Lab as we do our field work, which looks at problem-solving as having these 4 components of learning about a problem, imagining what the solution might look like, and then creating that solution and then getting feedback. And there's different points where participation can happen in each of these. And as I said before, frequently we're limited to the learn and test side when we think about participation, but the imagine and create side is such an important part to engage people in participation, because that's where they accrue those benefits, those intangible benefits that lead to personal transformation. So I wanted to just share the results of a project that we did in South Sudan, which was about building resilience and social cohesion through engaging people in the design process. What we did was we ran these community design trainings and set up maker spaces so that we developed a local innovation ecosystem where people could work together on projects that improved their lives. And we specifically engaged people from different tribes in these trainings. In many cases, those tribes were in conflict with each other. And it was a relatively short project, about 2 years, but one there we had very deep impacts. And I wanted to share with you just some quotes from those participants that just sort of exemplify, I think, some of the benefits that can come from people being engaged in the entire problem-solving process, not just the needs assessment and feedback at the end. So one of the participants said that he felt proud when he had made the technology, and since he made the technology, he had not slept hungry for days now. So that speaks to the value of the product, right? Because I don't want to imply that there isn't value in the products of design and engineering. And this was just, to me, a very powerful quote. Next, Monica, who's in this picture here, said that she felt happy and proud of herself for having developed a wheel cart. Some of my friends asked me where I got it from, and I told them that my team and I developed it. And they were shocked and proud of the great work. So here she had a personal transformation about the way she thought about herself, but also the way her community thought about her as a person that they were proud of, and that she was proud of herself for having accomplished the development of the transportation cart that she had made. Right. So this one speaks to the social cohesion that happened, where one of the participants said that, in fact, I met a lot of friends from here where we have sat and eaten together. Some of them I used to see as enemies, but now we are tight friends, and it is the CCB that did that. And the CCB is the name of the training that we did. So here we looked at how having people join together in problem solving really brought them together in a way that was different than just sitting around and talking about peace and what peace could look like. So they commented that they really appreciated that opportunity to work on something tangible together. And then finally, this one speaks again to personal transformation, where one participant said that he was expecting the training to change me from being bad to good. Like I said before, that I was a raider. So the conflict in South Sudan is often around cattle raids and people raiding the cattle from other tribes. But now I am a scientist with technologies that have not been there before. So this speaks to the transformation of him and with his role within society, and hopefully within the way that the tribes treat each other. So this was a project that John Jal and I worked on together, and I feel like it exemplifies the power of participation, not just the power of the solutions that were created, but the power of the inclusion and participation on the participants themselves. So this is something that I think is fundamentally important within the context of engineering and design, and I would just like to challenge the engineers in the room to think about who's doing the problem solving and what benefits are they accruing. Are you the only one getting the joy of creativity, or is that spread throughout the people who are experiencing the challenge themselves? And I think that that's one of the things that we strive to teach our students, to think about those benefits and for whom they accrue. So with that, I will close my comments, and I will be, am I handing things over to Jal yet? No, I didn't see any waves. So I am delighted to hand things over to Michael Stein, who, as he mentioned before, works at Harvard, and he will be talking a little bit about the participatory dynamics of the work that he does, and specifically within the context of engaging people with disabilities in climate justice. So, Michael.
Thank you very much, and I'm so glad that you were converted into a panelist as well, both because the work that comes out of your lab is exceptional, and also because the themes really do connect really well. You had a grounding in human rights yesterday in the morning, and you had a lot of chapter and verse on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD, during the afternoon workshop, and I'm not going to be doing that. But I do want to just talk about some themes and some ideas that connect with it. If I had to describe the CRPD in one sentence, I would point to the slogan of the International Disability Rights Movement: nothing about us without us. Don't make decisions for us, don't plan our lives out, don't create legislation, policies, and day-to-day existence without us being part of it. A lot of it is a pushback against paternalism, ableism, and other isms over the years. And if I'm talking disability, I hope within your minds you're also thinking of parallels within gender, sexuality, race, and so on. So nothing about us without us within the convention itself. It's the first convention on the rights of persons with disabilities internationally. The population is roughly 15% of the globe, 1.3, 1.5 now, billion people. And yet the UN system excluded people with disabilities. And by excluded, I really mean that genuinely. The Millennium Development Goals from 2000 to 2015 do not have the D word in it. The complaints at the treaty body systems, the human rights mechanisms you heard about yesterday, over a period, the decade before this convention, a total of 17 complaints. The word disability doesn't appear in CEDAW, the Women's Convention. It doesn't appear rarely in the Children's Rights Convention, and there it's very retrograde. Children with disabilities should not be discriminated against in the preamble, and in Article 23, they should be included in schools to the extent possible. Well, for 1989, that's rather advanced, but looking at it with 2024 eyes, that seems really out of sync. So there is this treaty because we were excluded from UN work, from national level work. At that time, out of 196 UN member states, maybe 40 of them had national level disability laws. So nothing about us without us. And parts of the convention go to the idea of participation and inclusion, but it has to be meaningful participation, and this links very nicely back to our moderator's framing. There are times at which, I work up here. So last week I was at the UN. Later this week I'm lecturing at UNITAR. In 2 weeks I'm back at the UN. I was at the G7 summit, ministers, about a month ago. And that's policy, and that's up here. But the interaction, how do you figure out implementation, or maybe in engineering its application, can only be done if you're sitting around a table and talking about what happens next. First of all, what is it that we're going to create, and then what happens next. So when the SDGs were negotiated, and they are a success story in the sense that disability appears 7 times in them, and then is lumped together with other vulnerable populations. We're vulnerable because we're excluded, but vulnerable populations another 6 times. There was no sort of sit down with the operations people on what does this mean? What does this mean? And I am on, or was on, UN DESA's advisory board for the SDGs, and I was lobbying very heavily to sit down with the economists and say, what does this mean? What happens when it hits the ground, and how do you implement it? And that didn't come about. But sometimes it does come about. In September, I did a workshop with the joint research wings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And we talked about climate change, and I pointed out the exclusion of disability from national level programming. And we had a several-hour discussion, which will continue at some point, about what does this mean? How can you effectuate change if you're up here? And how does it trickle down? Because someone at the operations level has to know how to do that. And we don't have that. We have toolkits that are published, we have guidance notes, but we don't actually have this sort of really nuts and boltsy, no pun intended, kind of how do you implement rights. So nothing about us without us is the theme I'd like you to come away from. During Q&A, I can give you all kinds of fun and not so fun examples about inclusion and exclusion, but it has to be meaningful participation. On the issue of inclusive climate responses, disability inclusive co-design is absolutely necessary to the development of inclusive climate responses. Again, worldwide, there's a population of 1.3 billion people. They are disproportionately impacted by climate change. I could throw all kinds of numbers out to you. So Australia, from 2001 to 2016, their study of wildfires, 89% of fatalities are individuals with one or more disability. Something's wrong with that picture. This is an empirical number. The British Columbia wildfires, 90% of people, fatalities, one or more comorbidities with disability. People with psychosocial disabilities, 2 to 4 times more likely to die because of heat than others. But they're systematically excluded, all people with disabilities, from climate policies and solutions. The Paris Agreement, something like 80% of the parties, the countries, don't even have the word disability in their nationally determined contributions. And those that do kind of lump them again together in this vulnerable category, them, those. And as the economists will tell you, I like working with economists too, if you're not counted, you don't count. So how do you implement that, right? If you're not there, how do you implement it? Sometimes you do with really socially conscious, thoughtful people who are on the ground and are implementing, but that's happenstance. That's not by design. And you don't want to rely on happenstance. You want to rely on design. So the policies don't often consider people with disabilities, but a climate justice approach views them not only as agents of change and knowledge holders, makers, and doers. I've heard the expression several times over the last day or so about engineers being problem solvers, which is great. And in the disability community, we also talk about being problem solvers, because navigating a world which has not been designed with us in mind requires coming up with alternative means of figuring out how to get to how to pass go and collect your $200. Co-designing climate responsive solutions with people with disabilities ensures that it's inclusive, it's desired, it's functional, and it's intuitive. It ensures that the infrastructure is a more valuable public good, and that decarbonized accessible public transport, which serves the broad community, including people with disabilities, children, and older persons, is actually inclusive. When we don't think about the group, we don't include them. So charging stations that people with disabilities can't reach, the new hybrid cars that make no noise, and my friends at the National Federation of the Blind are scared to death of them because they can't cross the street. And even simpler things. Again, my friends from NFB, they used to love their ovens with dials on them. Remember those? Those of us over 30. Now it's all electronic or digital, and they can't see it, and there's no noises. So not considering the needs of others. By failing to include disability design at the forefront, it leads ultimately to costlier retrofitting. It's much cheaper to start to begin with than to retrofit, and that's whether it's the internet or whether it's a building or whether it's any other kind of thing. Higher carbon emissions, human rights harms experienced by people with disabilities. And inclusive designs can serve the heterogeneous disability population, even though we have diverse disabilities and intersectional requirements, we haven't used that word enough, that arise due to age, gender, race, low income, and local contexts and lifestyles. And when I work with ministers or others and they talk about how the diverse community of people with disabilities makes it too complex, too difficult, there's too many different types of disabilities, I ask them, so you're willing to say that all women are the same and have the identical needs? All women have exactly the same? Really? Okay, you go on record as that. I'm not going there. Inclusive sustainable designs required across sectors, from disaster risk reduction to WASH. We talked about water sanitation over the last 2 days, not so much access to hygiene, and urban planning. You saw yesterday some of the photos from Colombia, and research on the built environment with local disability communities identified their lived experience through photos, interviews, and co-design activities. Nothing about us without us. Nobody knows their lives as well as the actual stakeholders. And that's for any group that we talk about. And it's not only a matter of human rights and of decency and of ethics, it's also a matter of efficiency. You don't know what I need, and I don't know what you need until we actually sit and have that open discussion. And then we don't have to retrofit so much afterwards. These workshops included participatory mapping, journey mapping, priority setting. They looked at things like barriers to the first and last mile of transportation hubs, access to education, healthcare, and information. They did global mapping so they could figure out how to get around. Stakeholders can engage in climate-responsive urban planning using digital participatory collaborative mapping tools, but these tools often don't accommodate people with disabilities. And there was a Dutch case study on accessibility in public spaces that co-designed a mapping tool with people with physical disabilities. Again, asking the population what they need. Some of the things that come out of fancy Global North labs, including GPS and how to navigate the accessible route between X and Y, can be quite good if you have one of those fancy phones. Personally, I don't. And if you can access the internet, which in parts of the developing world you can't. But for example, one group that some of my colleagues and I worked with, also in Colombia, blind group, actually wanted the tactile white cane that can tell them where the sidewalk was broken and where there was a hole in it or where there was a tree growing up in the middle of the sidewalk. Because telling them to go from A to B based on a map was one thing, but not walking into a tree or falling off the sidewalk was another thing. So again, local context being responsive to it. And there's huge opportunities to design technologies that are inclusive, accessible, and assistive. And there's huge opportunities to have these efforts led by people in the Global South. My friend Jonathan Lazar and I did 2 books on accessible technology in the Global South, looking at the innovations that they come up with within the markets and the costing constraints that they have to deal with, and things that they came up with that were really clever and interesting. And too often we just think about Global North to Global South. We're going to ship it down there based on our economics, based on our costs, based on our market. And I actually got in trouble at Larry Summers' think tank because I was the human rights person on a panel and 3 others were economists. And basically they talked about how you had to change the market in order for their services at their prices and their support systems, et cetera, to be adopted. And I said, no, you're doing it the wrong way. It's got to be the opposite. What do these people need? What can they afford? And how do you innovate in order to respond to their needs, not to shove it down their throats? We see a lot of that in the wheelchair realm too. People feel very good about shipping out wheelchairs, and I'm not turning my nose up to it. I would be nowhere, literally, without my wheelchair. But if you can't fix it, if you can't support it, if you can't use it, and these things you can't solder, what good does it do? So in low and middle income countries, people with disabilities are again often at heightened risk of climate change, unemployment, underemployment, poverty. Just to give you an example, we had some numbers yesterday, but in the African continent, the formal labor market is often up to about 80% unemployment rate among people with disabilities, and they're in the informal sector doing piecemeal work, gig work, and others, very often dangerous work. Because other people don't want to engage in it. So there are different designs, and we can talk about them later. There's a co-design activity about prosthetics in Uganda, but there was also one in Vietnam that I was lucky to engage with. And there the whole idea was to set up the prosthetics making devices with the local people with disabilities so that when the NGO goes bye-bye, they own it, and they continue to work on it, and they figure out how to craft things and tailor them in such a way that's sustainable and can continue once you leave. 3D printing has been very interesting and wonderful device that has enabled some of these things. So again, co-designing, working with people with disabilities, not just ethics, but also efficiencies. They know their needs more than anyone else. And it's a joy. It is an absolute joy to go and work with your arms open, your ears open, your heart open, and to listen to people and to their needs and to try to respond to them rather than coming in and coming with a plan or a template. You can have all kinds of ideas and tool sets, but rather than coming with a plan and being, they like to use the word colonialist too much, but in this case, colonialist. So thank you for that. I look forward to our dialogue, and I'll pass on to John.
Thank you, Michael. And now John will talk a little bit about a couple of case studies from his work in Latin America and Brazil. Well, Brazil's in Latin America, we know that, but in any case, and he will look at sort of both the micro level and the macro level as he takes us through some examples of his work.
Can you give me the PowerPoint? So thank you, Amy, and thank you, Michael, from bringing the perspective of the Global South. So I'm speaking a little bit about my experience in the Latin American context. I have been embedded in the issues of inclusion participation as a researcher and as a practitioner. As a researcher, I've been investigating engaged engineering initiatives and academic programs in collaboration with Latin American colleagues. We have a Latin American network. So these initiatives, they demand another kind of engineering, opposing the views of conventional engineering, which is neutral in value. So a kind of engineering that can affect social change by rethinking engineering and its practices. One of our predictions has been this book trilogy, Engaging Engineering and Other Technical Practice. We have a total of 40 chapters authored by the practitioners, written in their language. So you find chapters in Portuguese, Spanish, and English. Amy's here, and Juan Licena is also here because they are active in Latin America. As a practitioner, I already spoken that I'm founder coordinator of Lab CTS, Laboratory of Citizenship and Social Technologies. I must say, Amy Smith was very inspiring to me the first time we met 2012 in São Paulo at an IDDS, and a few times later. So our engaging engineering path is quite similar to Amy's. We are an interdisciplinary team, and I have been engaged in quite a lot of different kind of projects with different durations, participation levels, and collaborations, from community internet, social entrepreneurship, waste cooperatives, and many more. So Amy has challenged me to bring up something surprising in my experiences. And, well, I have talked about the question, what if the social groups we are working with don't have the same conception and expectation about participation and about inclusion? The context is, well, among our projects, we have a mandatory discipline working, in which we work with 16 engineering groups in 2 schools, 8 groups in each school. This is called Engineering Formation Citizenship. And in these schools, around 40% of the pupils come from vulnerable backgrounds and struggle to find purpose in their education, leading to them to disengage from study and job opportunities, which negatively impacts their life prospects. So, in words of the school teachers, they say the pupils see themselves as mongrels. I don't like this wording, but it is a metaphor to express how they feel. And we ask about their life projects, and any dreams seem unreachable. So they have they have low self-esteem. And what happens if you come to school and invite people to participate in our projects? Exactly these kind of pupils, they refrain, they resist, and they have difficulty to come in touch. So what is interesting is that my ETA students, you know, the Aeronautics Technological Institute was founded in 1950 and was crucial to the creation of the Brazilian aerospace industry, the Embraer. So it is an elite school. My students are of an elite school coming to a public school in which people don't value education. So it's a clash of cultures and expectations. And my ET students value projects with a high technical proficiency, but it's actually not what works in the schools if you think inclusion. What is essential here, what is working in these projects? Sharing personal stories, recognizing the talents of the pupils. For example, pupils which excel in comic book illustrations, which we incorporate into co-design Canva projects. And surprisingly, a visit to the Astronomical Observatory was reported as being an extraordinary novel experience. By contrast, building a mini satellite prototype, this is the thing of my students, wasn't far less interesting and impacting in their views. The next question I'm addressing is how to integrate more human rights dimensions into the technical project, having larger impact, using the words of Shirley Jackson. In Latin America, we have come up with the following strategies: encouraging connection to public policies, collaborating with social movements, evaluating if more empowering dimensions can be integrated in the project, and exploring the colonial perspectives, or non-Western perspectives. Let me show you briefly the example of the indigenous people's cartography of rights and threats. Here, satellite technology and mapping help us to have a reliable overview of issues such as violence, indigenous territories, arson. We have had a big problem with arson last year. Deforestation, preservation, oil exploitation, among others. He's Chai Sugui. She's denouncing the murder of her friend Ariwa Wall, who was killed for protecting nature. Techo, a non-profit organization that works with infrastructure in favelas or slum communities, uses similar methods. They work in several Latin American countries. Techo participatory methodologies strive to empower community self-organizing capabilities. And cartographies help communities fight for the rights to adequate and safe housing, many of which are affected by climate change and heavy rains, to right of access education and health service, among other rights. So in both cases, indigenous peoples and Techo, the mapping involve participation in feeding the information and allowing possible outcomes by fostering partnerships, advocacy work, as well as engineering action and imagination and search for solutions. Thank you. I put some reference here. Yeah, thank you. Back to you. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, John. And we'd like to open things up for questions from either the Zoom audience or for people in the room. So we'd love to hear. We can either take them one by one or hear a couple at a time. So I'm depending on what the pileup is on Zoom. But let's start here.
Good morning. Thank you so much. 2 questions. Professor Stein, you mentioned yesterday and today a couple statistics on how incorporating these kinds of ideas around addressing disabilities early on is cheaper than retrofitting. Can you provide a little bit more information on that and whether studies have been conducted on that? And the second is, are there any for-profit companies that work in this space, whether it is for-profit engineering firms that do design work that incorporate ideas of human rights or disability rights or whatever into what they do? Because it seems like most of the organizations that do this kind of work tend to be nonprofits. And I was just wondering whether there were examples of for-profit companies.
Wonderful questions, especially because they're difficult. The studies that exist in here's what development costs when it's inclusive ex ante, and here's how much it costs afterwards. The ex ante generally comes to between 1/2 and 3/4%. Making a building accessible before you go there, making a bus accessible before you go there. The post-fitting depends on what you're post-fitting. Are you putting in an elevator, which means the shaft, which costs lots of money? Or are you putting in something else? What we are missing empirically, if we're being data heads, and I'm one on occasion, is we don't actually have a thorough, empirically rigorous cost-benefit analysis of inclusive design or inclusive development versus non-inclusive design or development. Pretty much the only entity that could do that would be the World Bank, possibly one of the other development banks. I've been asking them since about 2008 to do it. The idea being, here's World A and here's World B. You'd have to think very deeply and make really strong arguments about how to weight certain variables, such as can we really say that in an inclusive environment every individual will be employed and therefore pay this amount of taxes and therefore offset this amount of social welfare benefits? No. So you'll need to make arguments about it, but it's only the World Bank or an entity like that could do it, and they don't. We have a few selected studies that kind of try to do that. So, one of my former students, Morgan Banks, who's now London School Tropical, right, has a case study with Hannah Joyner that's online, and you could look at the costs of inclusion or exclusion of children with disabilities. Kamal Lamanchani from Nepal, who's been in Japan for ages, has a study on inclusive versus exclusive education within Japan. But the number of studies that actually do this rigorously are very few. Engineers, I wish I knew more. You're all so nice. There are lots of efforts in the NGO community to try to collaborate on inclusive design, inclusive engineering. And if we're talking about disasters, then we're talking about an entire field of disability inclusive disaster development and relief, DIDRR, of which CBM, the Christian Blind Mission, is one of the leaders in that area. Well, there are some nice ones. There's a wonderful architectural firm in Cambridge, and you'll probably have to remind me, and I'll kick myself in the head afterwards. But one of my friends there is a deaf architect, and he wants to design things with sight lines. But there are, and of course, there's the design lab at MIT and others down the street from us.
Yeah, and just to follow up, there are a number of for-profit design firms that do this work on a, certainly within the humanitarian sector. So some of them do it at perhaps a reduced rate, but for many of them, particularly in terms of humanitarian aid, it is a for-profit business for them. So I know that I think Frog Design does some things, IDEO, and I don't know the litany and also how their cost structure goes, but it is definitely providing materials in crisis is big business. There's a lot of money that goes into actually providing the products that are distributed. And when you talked about interesting studies, one of the things that I've always wanted to study, and again, it requires a bigger entity to do it, is just this idea of, so most organizations measure by how many technologies have been distributed rather than how many have been adopted and used. And you'll see things certainly within the context of solar cookers, for example, where thousands of them are distributed and very few are actually used. I think in one study I read less than 2% of them were in use a year after implementation. Many of them are in use for thatched huts. Rain can come in through the top, so if you turn your solar cooker upside down and cover the top of your roof, it prevents rain from coming into the house. So it's used in one way, but not what was intended. And one of the things that I find interesting is, so sometimes it's a question of the technologies aren't what people are interested in. Other times it's a resistant to adopt a technology that you're not familiar with. And I have a friend who did a study where even just, she showed that even just people being exposed to water treatment technologies, even if they hadn't used them before, if they had sort of seen them, they trusted them more when they were implemented in a relief situation. So this idea of what brings people to adopting technologies, I think, is really important and can help to promote the rights which we're wanting to preserve. And one of the things that I find very curious is if you train people in the design process, in the technology creation process, do they then become more likely to adopt technologies that are being implemented later on? So, for example, the people who made that wheel cart, are they more likely to adopt bed nets because they're familiar with new technologies? I think that speaks to the sort of the new experience of going to the observatory that you mentioned, right? So, if there's a novelty to something, does that make it appealing or does that make it scary? And then how do you lower the barriers to adoption to technologies that can be either life-saving or life-enhancing, but that might be resisted in the context of displacement in particular?
Just adding up to this question of profit and non-profits, I could mention two initiatives in Brazil. One is a company called Diagonal. Civil engineering, they make projects in favelas, but they depend on public money. So it's always public-private partnerships. And I have been interviewing this leader, is a woman, civil engineer. She was talking to me how much she learned through participation, and so how the projects get more robust and could attend much better the communities. Another example is the $1 glasses. So I don't know if you know, this was a winner of an Actors International competition of a German guy, and we have $1 glasses in Brazil. And in Brazil, they combine non-profit with profit. So they have two branches. The non-profit makes donations, you know, and the profit one sells service for fabrics, in which the employees don't know that they need glasses or better glasses. So they make the exams and in order to increase productivity. Yeah.
I'll ask a couple. Sorry. Yeah, we can collect a few. I just want to tell people online, we have a couple hundred people online. Please submit questions via the Slido platform if you scroll below the web player. And I'll ask one question and then we can collect a couple in the room. My question was if you could all speak to the cultural and mindset shifts that are necessary in engineering to foster more equitable and holistic participation, especially of groups historically excluded from engineering decisions.
I wanted to address the question that was just asked about for-profit companies and the answer that was given, which sounded to me like it was the answer to a different question, because maybe I misunderstood the question or heard it differently. There are organizations that are for-profit that incorporate human rights design into the creation of their widgets, whatever they happen to be, or their systems. And in fact, a gentleman from Brazil who designed the new system for getting around the airports in Brazil prior to the Olympics, and notably the Paralympics, spoke at an event one time to explain how he took into account the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, to ensure that wayfinding and access and both human and technology resources were available to people coming through the airport, such that now that that's in place, people, it's a curb cut. People who are not necessarily associated with the Olympics can still access it, and even better. And so it improved things, even though it's just a for-profit organization without any nonprofit. And the other part of that is that for addressing persons with disabilities, and I would add persons with invisible disabilities, not just the ramps and things that are commonly thought of, it's not a separate way of creating things. It's not another ramp. It's not another bus. It's not another way of doing things. It's integrated into the system that everybody uses. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Mohammed Zaman. I'm from Boston University, a Director Center on Forced Displacement, Refugees, Internally Displaced Persons. And the question is to Amy, in many of these places, the fundamental problem is actually a political one, right? I mean, that is the core problem. It is not, I mean, the fact is that there is a power dynamic. People can be rounded up, they can be sent back to their countries, all of those kinds of things. They can be sent back to places that they come from. In that situation, with that uncertainty and anxiety, and especially in places where people are there for, I don't know, generations, how do you see the solutions that you're working on addressing some of these deeper problems of society? The fact that you are living under a microscope. The fact is that you could be cordoned off, and we saw that in COVID, that people were basically cordoned off and were in a very, very precarious state in northern Uganda, in Pakistan, elsewhere as well. So how do you see, perhaps philosophically, the role of design, of engineering, in these kinds of contexts where the real problem is actually not an engineering one, it's a political one? And how do we sort of go and think about addressing the bigger issue here?
Sure. Well, maybe I can start by responding and then to that question, and then we'll work in reverse to get to the other ones. So, and I wish that John Jal was here because his organization is in large part working on those types of issues. One of the things that I would find is that there's a few answers that I would bring to that. The first one is just about the ability of being involved in the problem-solving process as a way to feel some control over the situation that you're in, to be able to impact your lives and what what's affecting you at that moment. And I think that has a certain, certainly not sufficient, but it adds towards alleviating some of the challenges that you talked about. One of the things that we try very hard to do is to have co-creation sessions, which include NGOs, refugees from different ethnic groups within the context as well, so that they're better able to hear each other's voices and understand the challenges. An example that I think is interesting is that, John Jal was actually a participant in one of our design trainings and has now become an implementer of them through his organization. And one of the projects that they're working on right now is to do a local radio station where he and his organization, which is a community-based organization, refugee-led, so it's made up of youth from a variety of the different tribes that are represented in the refugee camps, and they're across many refugee camps. So what they're concerned about the tensions that arise due to the spread of misinformation, and so they want to create a radio system so that they can combat the conflict that arises from the spread of misinformation within the camp. So here's a situation where by being empowered to sort of believe in your capabilities to design and create solutions, while they might have originally started with the design of a wheel cart or of something to process cassava or something that is more tangible, the application of the design process to more systemic challenges is something that we've seen. And so we're seeing it in those camps where people are looking at how can they design things that help to address gender-based violence? How can they design things that help to alleviate conflict that's spread through misinformation? So I hope that sort of answers your question, but I will be the first to admit that that the political constraints are far beyond the capacity of simple design projects to address, right? And so there's multiple levels, but it's interesting to see how those levels can intersect with each other. So, and then just real quickly going back to sort of your comments around for-profit entities, I'm reminded of a few large corporations that do, I think, good work in terms of engaging with end users effectively. Hindustan Lever, Unilever is well known for the type of work they've done to respond more specifically to the needs of people living in poverty in their market areas, and that's a huge company. I think one of the things that they did early on was make sort of individual sachets of their product so that people who can't afford a large bottle of shampoo can buy a smaller bottle. Or, similarly, there's so many things that if you walk through markets in Africa that you'll see in individual packets because that's what people can afford given the way that their income comes in. So you will see that there are selected like large corporations, but also there are for-profit companies that make wheelchairs, right? That do solar electrification. I think we saw some projects yesterday that showed the solar electrification of hospitals, and those are other things that are often done by for-profit organizations. And I think that it's important to recognize that we sometimes put a value judgment on that characteristic, and I don't think it should be, because there are many for-profit organizations that are driven by a social mission. Several of my students have started for-profit organizations to address challenges of poverty through market means, and so I think that's there. And maybe I'll hand over, and then we can all come back to the mindset question as well. So.
I don't have an answer on how to solve the world's politics. I wish I did. But I would also add that it's cultural as well. But engineers and others who are designing can make lives easier on some level. Years ago, we did a case study of the Bihari refugees left behind in Bangladesh. And the ones who have disabilities, the blind ones, fall into the latrines. The women with disabilities who are still tasked with caregiving with the disability, without a disability, that's the way our paternalistic world works, would have difficulty carrying water. So there was designed, it looks like one of those kids' toys. Remember the one with the stick and there's a rolling wheel on it? You put the water in it and you push it rather than having to carry it, and it's a lot lighter. So there are engineering designs that can make lives a little bit easier. Some refugee camps have, very minority of them, have come around. Zatari is, of course, the star, and everyone goes and looks at Zatari. But they do have an inclusive school. And UNICEF is working on making sure that refugee camps, schools that are provided, are more inclusive. I wouldn't say that they're all inclusive, but more inclusive. So there are good practice examples of that arise. And I would also add, I like the solar-powered hearing aids too. I like those as well. Don't need to find a plug.
I will link to Casey's question about how to be careful with cultural bias. Well, I think this is quite challenging because we all are very much imprisoned, if you like, in our own biographies and positions in the world, and language and culture. But there are many ways of expanding these views. I think one thing is trying to learn more about ethnocentric bias. So what is obvious for Westerners or white people, so like Michael said yesterday, the dominant views is not obvious for other minorities. And so there is a lot of sensibility required here to make place for other views. And another thing I think is valuing different knowledges. So we have had projects in poor communities, for example, building a evapotranspiration sewage system. And the locals knew so much, they gave so much useful ideas because they work in construction. So you can integrate local knowledge. And the same case, there is a wonderful bundle of projects in Rio Negro, close to Colombia, in Amazonia, with ventures in which they work with dozens of Baniwa indigenous peoples, and they export chili and mushrooms, high quality, but to run by women and cooperatives, and they take great care of valuing to traditional ways. They're quite complex, in which they exchange the genetics of chilies, for example, in rituals. And it's quite interesting how science is able to make clear that they are not the primitives which most people believe to be the indigenous peoples, but they have quite complex systems and knowledge to be valued.
Thanks. And I'd just like to go back to that first question, which was about mindsets. And I think this is a really great question because many of us who go into engineering, we do it because we love solving problems, right? We are problem solvers. I mean, human beings are problem solvers, but we choose engineering because we really love doing it. And in fact, our universities tell us that, you know, you are the future. You are going to solve the problems of the future, right? So it's a you know, discourse that we hear all the time. However, if you're thinking about participation, maybe you shouldn't be the problem solver. Maybe you should be the facilitator of problem solving, and that's a mindset shift. The tricky thing is to not, to hide your light under a bushel, because one of the things that's true is that you bring something to the table as well. And so I often will hear students saying, well, you know, you're the local experts, you do it when they're in a community. And well, if you're bringing nothing to the table, then don't sit at the table, right? And so this idea of valuing your contributions while not overshadowing the process, I think, is a very important mindset shift that we need to incorporate into the way we teach students about engineering solutions within the context of when you're working with stakeholders who are traditionally marginalized. You know, we have market studies and, you know, companies that do market testing that allow the voice of, you know, wealthy consumers to appear in product development. But where we don't have that, I think it's incumbent on the engineers to think about what is their role in problem solving, and to not take themselves completely out of it, but to make sure they bring people into it, hence the importance of inclusion and participation in the engineering process.
Okay. Thank you so much for the great discussion this morning. I want to bring to your attention, for those of you who don't know about it, the work of E.F. Schumacher, who wrote the book Small is Beautiful, and that book, written in the 1970s, is still appropriate today. And many of the things we talked about this morning and yesterday are covered also in that book. Also glad you mentioned the global north and the global south. There's no such thing as a global north and a global south. There's a global planet that has global issues that need to be addressed together. My own experience in the developing world, I don't like the term developing world either, because we're all developing in one way or the other. But there's so much experience in the so-called developing world that we can bring to the developed world. And I think that Michael, you mentioned that. Just amazing. I've found, you know, creativity everywhere on the planet, in the middle of the Sahara, in the middle of the jungle, and so on. Young people who are not engineers, they don't have a PhD, but they solve problems on a daily basis. So I think it's for us, from the global north, it's important for us to have humility. Humility to accept that other people who don't have a PhD and don't have a master's degree, are not highly educated, have solutions for the entire planet. That's what I want to talk about. Also, one more remark. Years ago, I visited a program at University of Massachusetts Lowell on assistive technology for people with disabilities. I have not seen a single program in the US that is doing the same thing. So far as I'm concerned, that's the only program in the US, and correct me if I'm wrong, that essentially focuses, that has a department on essentially assistive technology. There are 250 million people, kids in the world, who have disabilities. There are 800 million people in the world who have disabilities. And as you mentioned, Michael, in a period like Katrina, many people could not even move, people with disabilities. In refugee camps, if you've ever been to a refugee camp, you see people with disabilities who cannot move, who cannot do anything. They die, essentially. So where are the engineering schools in the West or anywhere else that can focus on assistive technology for people with disabilities? I only know of one. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
It's Small is Beautiful.
The young people don't know about the book. That's interesting. Yeah. It's Small is Beautiful.
Many years ago. And it has
1970s. And please read it. This is probably the 10th edition by now, 20th edition. Please read it. There are several videos. It really emphasizes, actually it was called intermediate technology for a long time. Now it's called appropriate technology. Appropriate to who? To the customers, to the people who use it. What's appropriate to Los Angeles is not appropriate to a small community in Africa and vice versa. But in both cases, it's appropriate. It solves problems. It essentially brings kids to school, and people don't have to die by the end of the day. And that's what the most important part. Small is beautiful.
And it has a wonderful tagline, which is small is beautiful, economics as if people mattered.
So I recognize we only have a few minutes left. When all of you were talking about your participatory and inclusion processes, it made me think of design thinking strategy. And Amy, you in particular had a circular model on your slide deck that kind of walked through the design thinking. So I'm curious, not just in kind of your kind of design work with communities, but when you were designing your own participatory strategies, you know, often you have to come up with prototypes and then you test a prototype and then you iterate on it. So I'm curious from all of you, as you were going through these processes, what was, you know, one thing or two things that you learned and iterated on as you were developing your participatory design processes?
Oh, thanks for a great question, and it makes me think back to several years ago. And one thing I'll say is that we do teach the design process, and we find that builds resilience in people. That, you know, they'll want to create something and there's some barrier and they find a way to overcome it, which is something which doesn't always happen. Sometimes there's the barrier and you just go in a different direction. So it's something that I think the design process is incredibly important. I would call it design rather than design thinking because they're actually creating a product at the end, but it does create this mindset shift. One of the things that our program in design, which is called Creative Capacity Building, takes people through learning the design process. And as part of that, they learn several hands-on skills in terms of woodworking and metalworking. And they see examples of technologies, and then they create a technology as a framework for learning the steps of the design process. And in the early days, we would look at things that were needs within the community and lent themselves well to the design process in a short period of time. So things like a device that plucks the peanuts off of the roots of a peanut plant, because that's a laborious process. And so we would challenge everyone in the group to make a peanut plucker. And people liked it, and they came up with great ideas that helped reduce their labor. We knew that this was a challenge in areas where people grew peanuts, and it's also a design space which has lots of different possibilities, so you don't get the same groups creating the same solution, which can sometimes be less interesting and less rewarding for individuals. But what we found what we changed to was that on the end of the first day, we actually asked people, what do you want to work on? And people select their own projects. Even though they may be less interesting from a design space and they may be less feasible within the time that we have available, and it's certainly less predictable because you have no idea what people are coming up with. That evolution, I think, was really important because now when people talk about what they like about the training is they say that they like that they get to choose the problems that they're solving instead of being told what the problems are for them to address. So I think this, sort of learning from people, wanting to solve different problems and incorporating that into the curriculum, even though it makes it a little bit challenging, it's probably the hardest part of the curriculum is going through that problem identification process with the participants, is something which I think is one of the things they value most about the program. So that's one of the many things that we've learned through, and I like to say not through failure, but through the design process, which is, it should be learning, and calling it failure I don't think is accurate because if you learn from it, it wasn't a failure. So yeah.
I would only add to Amy to the experience is interaction. You have to adapt constantly. You find a lot of obstacles in the way. And so it is being in the field, talking to people, trying to do things, and having challenges all the time, all kind of challenges, not only technical, bureaucratic ones and financial. So this makes the project at the end, what is viable and what is interesting enough to help the co-construction project. I just wanted to make a small remark about words. So we can disagree about words. I have no problem with that. So, for example, indigenous peoples don't like inclusion because inclusion meant to be assimilated. So words have different meanings in different contexts. And we shall always ask, what do you understand about Global South, Global North, for example? I understand Global South as they excluded from the benefits of development. So I saw Global South as I arrived here on Sunday in Washington. People, waste pickers, they are Global South for me because they are the excluded. So words have meanings and we have different interpretations. I respect all the interpretations. I don't want to impose my one. Just a clarification. Thank you.
And I guess I've learned a lot. One thing I've learned certainly is how to speak plainly and clearly without jargon, because most of the people we work with here in the U.S. have intellectual or psychosocial disabilities. And outside the U.S., they're not native English speakers for the most part, and very rarely are any of them have high education. So if I'm at all a good teacher, it's because they taught me how to speak plainly and develop concepts from the ground up. But the most important lesson, and it echoes something Bernard said, is humility. We serve these communities, and we do so with great joy, but we serve these communities. We're not imposing an agenda, and you always learn amazing things. So one very quick, abbreviated one is I got to work on Vietnam's national disability law, the first two iterations of it, as well as their CRPD ratification. And to get the disability groups involved, because the ministries didn't want it, we had had many meetings before then. The night before this big convocation of experts, I said, no disabled law professor, no disabled people, no disabled law professor. And they said, no, you're different. And I said, no, I'm not. That's the whole point. And they brought them, and they allowed them, one question total. And then I went over to them and asked, what is the one thing you want from this disability law? Now, if I was being very American, right, I would talk about employment and education and access. And their answer was, we know it's going to be decades before we actually have any kind of equality or access, but right now we're called useless mouths. So we would like to be called people with disabilities so that we have dignity on a daily basis. I would never know that, never know that. So just listening with humility and being the conduit rather than the driver.
So as we draw this session to a close, I might say something which, so I've been a practicing engineer for my entire professional career. Engineering is a team sport, and not all the players are engineers. And I know that there's some folks here that don't appreciate that, but I think Michael, your closing comment was it's about the process and the intent of those that actually practice it. Amy has talked about the practice and so forth, but it's also the intent of those that that practice engineering to take the input that's needed and engage those that need to be engaged to get a good output from it. But engineering is a team sport. There's no one engineer that accomplishes anything. It's all done It's all done by teams. So anyway, my role here is just simply to bring this great opening panel to a conclusion. So let's give them a great finish at hand. And all, please come back at 10:45. Thank you.